Hi, today I want to tell you about a recent opinion piece, Probing Artificial Neural Networks, Insights from Neuroscience. Artificial neural networks of today can achieve impressive performance on many challenging tasks. For example, they can take an image as input and label the entity present in that image, in this case, a dog. And much time and energy is being spent on trying to understand what computations in their systems enable their success. This challenge is familiar to neuroscientists. A brain is also a complex information processing system that can do many challenging tasks. For example, a brain can also take an image as an input and produce the label dog. And for decades, neuroscientists have tried to figure out what computations enable this system's success. There are many ways you can go about trying to answer these questions. One way entails training a classifier to map within the system of interest and some features. For example, you can take activations in a given neural network layer or a brain region and ask if we can decode whether the entity being viewed is an animal or an inanimate object. And of course, the features you use can be much more complex than that, but the basic idea is that these features will help us shed some light on what's going on inside the system. And the classifier that's being used to map between the system and the features has many names in different literatures. Here, we're calling it a probe. And the key question we're trying to address is what design choices are important when designing a probe and what probe should look like in order to help us answer interesting scientific questions. Here I'm going to highlight two design choices. One is direction. The most common direction in AI research is a decoder probe going from the system of interest to predict some features. But of course, you can also go in the opposite direction. You can take some features of interest and ask how much variance in my system is explained just by using these features. The other choice is expressivity. Oftentimes in AI and neuroscience, the expressivity of a probe is bounded. Oftentimes, we restrict our probe to only consider linear mappings. But of course, it doesn't have to be the case. In principle, you can have a complicated probe like a multi-layer perceptron, and in this case, the space of possible mappings is essentially unbounded. So which choice is right? In the paper, we argue that the probe design depends crucially on the goals of the researcher and the questions they're trying to answer. And we use neuroscience evidence to highlight some of the goals that are relevant for researching artificial neural networks. Here, I'm going to mention two of these goals. One goal is testing feature predictability. This is just asking, can I decode my features from the system? There are many examples in neuroscience and AI. In neuroscience, one example is taking activations in the brain and using them to predict whether the brain is healthy or whether there is some neural disorder that is developing. In AI, there are also many possible examples. One example involves taking a language model, extracting the representation of a sentence, like the dog is heavy, and trying to predict the real world size or real world weight of the entity mentioned in the sentence, here, a dog. And if your main goal is predict the features of interest, then the natural probe direction is decoding. And the recommended expressivity of the probe is unbounded. You don't need to restrict the space of possible mappings. You want to give your probe the best shot at being able to decode features of interest. Another goal is discovering emergent structure. In this case, we don't just care about decoding the features, we also know what structure they have. Some examples in neuroscience involve going from representations extracted from a convolutional neural network trained on images to activity in a brain region that's responsible for processing images. In this case, the mapping doesn't just allow us to decode brain activity, it also allows us to compare the representational geometries of these two systems. An example from the AI literature is a syntax probe by Hewitt and Manning. Here, you can extract the representation of a sentence or a sentence chunk, like the chef who ran to the store, and reconstruct the syntactic tree based on the distances between the words. If your goal is to probe a structure, The direction might be encoding or decoding. You can see both examples here. It depends on the specific question you're asking and your setup. But what's really important is that the expressivity of the probe needs to be bounded. Essentially, the functional form of your probe is the hypothesis you're testing about the structure of the representations in the system. So in short, research goals really matter for designing a really good probe. Thank you for your attention.